A man who couldn't read until he was 18 built the machine that changed the world forever. Not a king, not a scientist with university degrees, not someone born into wealth or privilege. A coal miner's son who taught himself engineering by taking apart machines in the dark after 12-hour shifts underground. By the time George Stephenson died in 1848, his invention had spread across continents, reshaping cities, collapsing distances, and creating fortunes. Yet he'd started life in a one-room cottage beside a dirt track, so poor his family couldn't afford candles. The year was 1781. Britain was losing its American colonies. The Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum, but slowly, constrained by the fundamental problem of moving things. Goods travelled by horse, by canal barge, by human muscle. Coal sat in mines waiting for transport. Factories needed raw materials that took weeks to arrive. The entire economy was throttled by friction and distance. Into this world, on June 9th, George Stephenson entered screaming. The cottage where he was born stood directly beside the Wylam Wagonway, a wooden track where horses pulled coal wagons from the colliery to the River Tyne. From his earliest memories, George heard the creak of wheels, the clop of hooves, the shouts of drivers. This track, primitive as it was, represented the cutting edge of transport technology, and it was literally his backyard. His father Robert worked as a fireman at Wylam Colliery, operating a Newcomen atmospheric steam engine. This wasn't skilled work. Robert shoveled coal, maintained fires, watched gauges. He earned 12 shillings a week, supporting a wife and 6 children in conditions that would be unrecognisable as livable today. Neither Robert nor his wife Mabel could read. Education wasn't for people like them. It was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to keep children out of the workforce. George was the second child. He watched his older siblings go to work young. He knew what was coming. At age 8, while wealthy children were learning Latin, George was hired to herd cows along the wagonway, keeping them off the tracks. His job was preventing livestock from interfering with coal transport. 10 hours a day, every day, for pennies. But something was different about this boy. The machines fascinated him in a way they didn't fascinate other children. The steam engine his father tended, the wagonway system, the pumps and pulleys and mechanisms of the colliery. These weren't just tools to George. They were puzzles. How did they work? Why were they designed this way? Could they be better? At 14, he graduated to real colliery work. He became a picker, cleaning coal and removing stones. Then a fireman like his father, feeding engines and maintaining equipment. By 17, he was an engineman, operating a winding engine that hauled coal from the pit. Each promotion brought slightly more money and significantly more responsibility. But it also brought something else. Access. Working on the engines meant understanding them. George began staying late, examining mechanisms, asking questions of anyone who'd answer. The engines of the late 18th century were crude, inefficient, dangerous things. They broke constantly. Repairs were expensive. Collieries needed people who could keep them running. And George was developing that skill through pure, obsessive curiosity. Yet he couldn't read. At 18 years old, operating complex machinery, George Stephenson was illiterate. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, and news filtered into the mining communities. George wanted to understand what was happening. He wanted to read the newspapers, the technical manuals, the books that could teach him more about the machines he loved. So he enrolled in night school. After 10 or 12-hour shifts underground, covered in coal dust, exhausted, George walked to evening classes and learned his letters. He paid for this education himself, sacrificing money his family desperately needed. The other students were children. George sat among them, a grown man learning to spell, and he didn't care about the humiliation because he understood something crucial. Knowledge was power. He learned reading, he learned writing, he learned arithmetic, which came naturally to someone who'd been mentally calculating loads and pressures and fuel consumption for years. The theoretical mathematics that university students studied remained beyond him. Calculus, advanced algebra, the elegant abstractions that educated engineers wielded, these were foreign territory. But practical math, the kind you needed to build things, George mastered quickly. His education coincided with courtship. George had noticed Elizabeth Hindmarsh, called Betty, the daughter of a farmer in Black Collerton. They met secretly in her father's orchard. Young love, simple and genuine. George courted her properly, or tried to, but Betty's father refused to allow the marriage. The reason was blunt. George was a miner. Miners were poor, uneducated, rough. They weren't suitable husbands for farmers' daughters. The rejection stung, but George accepted it. He had no prospects to offer. He turned his attention to the Henderson family, where he lodged. First Anne Henderson caught his eye, but she rejected him. So he pursued her sister Frances, called Fanny, who was 9 years older. This wasn't the romantic passion of his youth with Betty. This was practical. Fanny accepted, and they married at Newburn Church on November 28, 1802. They moved to Willington Quay, east of Newcastle, into a single room of a cottage. George worked as a brakesman. The pay was barely enough. To supplement his income, he made shoes, he repaired clocks, he cut clothing patterns for miners' wives. Fanny helped where she could. They were grinding out survival week by week, hoping to build something better. In 1803, their son Robert was born. Finally, something good. George doted on the boy. He saw in Robert the possibility of a different life, one not spent underground breathing coal dust. Then in 1805, their daughter Fanny arrived. The family was growing, and so were the financial pressures. The infant Fanny died within months. The cause went unrecorded. Infant mortality was common enough that it barely warranted documentation in working-class families. George and Fanny grieved and pushed forward because there was no alternative. You kept working, you survived. Then in 1806, Frances herself fell ill. Consumption, they called it. Tuberculosis. A wasting disease with no cure, no effective treatment, just a slow decline, while the family watched helplessly. She grew weaker. She coughed blood. George worked longer hours to pay for doctors who couldn't help. Frances Stephenson died, leaving George a widower at 25 with a 3-year-old son. The grief must have been crushing. He'd lost his daughter, then his wife, within months of each other. He was alone with Robert, working brutal hours, earning barely enough to feed them both. Many men in his position would have collapsed, turned to drink, given up. George Stephenson made a different choice. He sent Robert to live with a local woman who could care for him during the day. Then George made a desperate decision. He'd go to Scotland to find better paying work. He left his son behind and travelled to Montrose, taking a position at a spinning factory. Better wages, but at the cost of being separated from the only family he had left. The separation lasted only months. George's father, Robert, had been working at a colliery when an accident occurred. A sudden blast of steam from a faulty engine valve. Robert Stephenson Sr. was blinded permanently. His working life was over, and he had no savings, no pension, nothing. George returned immediately. He moved back to a cottage at Westmore, bringing young Robert with him. George's unmarried sister Eleanor agreed to move in and care for the boy while George worked. The household now consisted of George, his blind father, his sister, and his son. 4 people depending on George's wages from the colliery. This was 1807. George Stephenson was 26 years old. He'd experienced poverty, bereavement, separation, and now the burden of supporting a disabled parent and a young child. He could have remained a colliery worker for the rest of his life, and no one would have blamed him. Survival was achievement enough, but George had been learning. Every moment he could spare, he'd been studying the engines, taking them apart mentally, understanding their principles, imagining improvements. In 1811, opportunity arrived in the form of a broken pumping engine at High Pit, Killingworth. The engine wasn't working properly. Killingworth Colliery needed it fixed, and the usual engineers had failed. George Stephenson, the widowed brakesman who read books by candlelight and dismantled machines in his spare time, offered to try. He was given permission. He fixed it. Not just fixed it, improved it. The engine ran better than it had when new. Efficiency increased, costs dropped. The colliery owners took notice. Who was this man? Where had he trained? The answers were nowhere and everywhere. He'd trained himself in the margins of an impossible life. In 1812, George Stephenson was promoted to engine wright for the Killingworth collieries. His responsibility now covered maintaining and repairing all the colliery engines. The pay increased substantially. More importantly, the position gave him authority and access. He could experiment. He could implement ideas. He could start thinking beyond just keeping existing machines running. His mind was already moving towards something bigger. The wagonways that carried coal were inefficient. Horses were slow, expensive to feed and maintain, limited in the loads they could pull. The stationary steam engines that hauled wagons on some routes were inflexible, requiring complex rope and pulley systems. What if you could combine the two? What if the engine could move? This wasn't an original idea. Others had built experimental locomotives. Richard Trevithick had demonstrated a steam-powered vehicle as early as 1804. But these machines were unreliable, expensive, and often broke the cast-iron rails they ran on. They were curiosities, not practical transport solutions. George Stephenson thought he could do better. He believed the problem wasn't the concept, but the execution. The designs were wrong. The materials were wrong. The approach was wrong. And unlike the educated engineers who'd failed before him, George had something they lacked: years of practical experience, keeping temperamental machines running in the worst possible conditions. He started sketching designs. He studied Matthew Murray's locomotive, travelling to nearby collieries to examine it. He made notes, mental calculations, plans. By 1814, he was ready to build. The locomotive he designed would be called Blücher, named after the Prussian general who'd fought Napoleon. It was constructed in the colliery workshop behind Stephenson's home, a small building called Dial Cottage on Great Lime Road. George worked on it himself, hands-on, solving problems as they emerged. Blücher used flanged wheels running on rails. The traction came from the contact between wheel and rail, not from any rack or cable system. This was crucial. It meant the locomotive could theoretically run on any track, not just specially designed routes. The engine could haul 30 tons of coal up a hill at 4 miles per hour. To modern eyes, that's absurdly slow. In 1814, it was revolutionary. The demonstration succeeded. Blücher worked. It pulled loads. It didn't break the rails. It was practical, not just theoretically interesting. George Stephenson had built a functioning locomotive without formal engineering training, without university education, without wealthy backers. He'd done it through observation, experimentation, and sheer stubborn determination. Over the next several years, he built 16 more locomotives at Killingworth. Each one incorporated improvements learned from the previous design. The engines became more reliable, more powerful, more efficient. George was teaching himself locomotive engineering by building locomotives, learning from every failure and success. But while his professional life was advancing, his personal life remained complicated. He was raising Robert alone, with help from his sister Eleanor. The boy was bright, curious, showing the same fascination with machines his father had. George made a decision that would define both their futures. Robert would receive the education George had been denied. He enrolled Robert in a Newcastle school to study mathematics properly. Real mathematics, taught by educated teachers. Every night when Robert came home, father and son would review the homework together. George learned alongside his son, filling gaps in his own knowledge while ensuring Robert mastered subjects that had been completely inaccessible to working-class children a generation earlier. This nightly study routine created more than just shared knowledge. It forged a partnership. Robert learned theoretical principles, while George provided practical context. The boy understood the mathematics of leverage and force. The father understood how those forces played out in real machines under real conditions. Together, they formed a complete engineer split across two people, and George needed every advantage he could get, because in 1815, something happened that would test both his technical skills and his social standing in ways he'd never experienced. The challenge came from an unexpected direction, and it would lead to one of the most bitter controversies of his entire career. The problem was fire. Coal mines in 1815 were death traps. Methane gas seeped from the coal seams, accumulating in pockets throughout the workings. Miners needed light to see, so they carried naked flames, open lanterns, candles. The combination was predictable and horrific. When flame met gas, the mine exploded. Men died instantly or slowly, buried under collapsed tunnels, burned beyond recognition, suffocated by toxic fumes. The death toll was staggering. Felling Colliery near Gateshead had lost 92 men in a single explosion in 1812. That wasn't unusual. Mining communities lived with constant grief, families destroyed by disasters that seemed almost routine. George knew these dangers intimately. He'd worked in mines his entire life. He'd lost friends, colleagues, men he'd shared shifts with. The explosions weren't abstractions. They were names, faces, families left behind. So when the Royal Society announced a competition with a substantial reward for anyone who could design a safety lamp, a light source that wouldn't ignite methane, George started experimenting. He had no laboratory, no scientific instruments, no formal training in chemistry or physics. He had his cottage, some wire mesh, and an understanding of how things actually worked underground. He began testing in late 1815. The principle seemed straightforward. If you could prevent the flame from directly contacting the gas, you could stop ignitions. But how? Glass broke too easily. Metal conducted heat. The solution needed to be both protective and practical for actual miners doing actual work. George tried various designs, working late into the night after his shifts. He tested different materials, different configurations. His approach was empirical, trial and error, seeing what worked rather than calculating what should work. The design he settled on used a cylindrical mesh of iron wire surrounding the flame. The mesh was fine enough that combustion couldn't pass through it. The flame inside the lamp would change colour when methane was present, warning miners without igniting the gas. Crucially, the lamp was simple enough that miners could actually use it. By early 1816, George had a working prototype. He called it the Geordie lamp, and local mine owners began testing it underground. It worked. Miners could carry light into gassy areas without causing explosions. Lives were being saved. But several hundred miles south in London, someone else was working on the same problem. Sir Humphrey Davy was everything George Stephenson wasn't. Aristocratic, educated at the Royal Institution, connected to the highest levels of British science, president of the Royal Society. When he announced his own safety lamp design in late 1815, the scientific establishment immediately hailed it as a breakthrough. Davy's lamp used similar principles to George's, employing wire gauze to contain the flame. The designs weren't identical, but they were remarkably close. Both men had arrived at the same solution through different routes. The question was, who got there first? Davy was convinced Stephenson had stolen his idea. The timing was suspicious. Davy had been working on the problem for months, presenting papers to learned societies, corresponding with other scientists. Then this provincial enginewright suddenly appears with a nearly identical design. Impossible. The man couldn't have developed it independently. He must have heard about Davy's work and copied it. The accusation was devastating. Stealing another man's invention was professional suicide. If proven, George would be ruined, his reputation destroyed, his career finished. What made the charge particularly painful was its foundation in class prejudice. Davy and his supporters couldn't conceive that an uneducated collier could produce genuine innovation. They didn't say this explicitly, but the implication was clear in every statement they made. Scientific discovery happened in laboratories and universities, not in miners' cottages. George's supporters in the north rallied. A local committee of inquiry was formed to investigate the timeline and establish who had invented what when. They interviewed witnesses, examined George's experimental apparatus, documented his work process. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Stephenson had been working independently. He'd developed his lamp without knowledge of Davy's research. Both men deserved credit. The committee awarded George £1,000, a substantial sum that recognised his contribution. But Davy's supporters refused to accept the findings. How could a committee of provincial mine owners possibly evaluate scientific priority? The matter required expertise they simply didn't possess. The dispute dragged on for years. It became bitter, personal, ugly. Davy went to his grave in 1829 convinced that Stephenson was a fraud and a thief. George never forgot the accusation or the condescension behind it. The experience hardened something in him, created a permanent distrust of London-based scientific experts who valued credentials over results. Years later, in 1833, a House of Commons committee finally ruled that both men had equal claim to the invention. It was the right decision, but it came too late to heal the damage. The controversy had already shaped how George saw the world and his place in it. The practical result was geographic division. The Davy lamp became standard throughout most of Britain. The Geordie lamp was used almost exclusively in the northeast, in the collieries where George was known and trusted. Both lamps saved lives, both were genuine innovations, but the political and social dynamics ensured that Davy's version became the official, recognised solution, while George's remained a regional alternative. What the safety lamp controversy revealed was a fundamental tension that would follow George throughout his career. He operated in a world where social class determined credibility, where an aristocrat's theory carried more weight than a worker's practical success, where innovation from the wrong sort of person was automatically suspect. And this tension was about to intensify, because George's next project would take him far beyond the colliery gates, into territory where his lack of formal credentials would be weaponized against him repeatedly. The mine owners who'd supported him during the lamp controversy were impressed enough to offer him a new challenge. They wanted a railway, not just a short tramway for moving coal around a colliery, but an actual railway spanning 8 miles from Hetton Colliery to the port of Sunderland. 8 miles doesn't sound like much, but in 1820 it represented an enormous leap in ambition. Most colliery railways were measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. They used horses, stationary engines, or gravity. The idea of using locomotives for the entire distance was radical. George accepted the commission. He designed a system that combined all 3 power sources strategically. Gravity handled downward slopes. Stationary engines pulled wagons up the steepest inclines, and for the level stretches and moderate grades, he would use locomotives. The Hetton Colliery Railway opened in 1822. It was the first railway in the world that didn't use horses at all. Every ton of coal travelled the full 8 miles, powered by mechanical means alone. To anyone who understood what this meant, it was revolutionary. Railways no longer needed to rely on animal power. They could be completely independent, limited only by the capabilities of their engines. The success at Hetton established George as more than just a locomotive builder. He was now a railway engineer, someone who could design entire systems, not just individual components. His reputation spread beyond the northeast coalfields, which is how he came to the attention of Edward Pease. Pease was a Quaker businessman in Darlington with a problem. The coal mines around Bishop Auckland needed better transport to the River Tees, at Stockton. The current system, horse-drawn wagons on dirt roads, was slow, expensive, and weather-dependent. Pease and his partners wanted to build a railway, a proper public railway that would carry coal to the river for export. They'd already obtained parliamentary approval in 1821. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was authorised. The route was surveyed. The plan was to use horses pulling wagons on metal rails, standard practice for the era. Then Pease met George Stephenson. We don't know exactly what was said in that meeting, but whatever George proposed, it convinced Pease to completely change the railway's design. Instead of horses, they would use locomotives. Instead of a simple wagonway, they would build something unprecedented, a public railway powered by steam. Pease made George the chief engineer. At age 40, after decades in the collieries, George was about to build something that would change Britain forever. The Stockton and Darlington Railway would be 25 miles long, connecting collieries near Bishop Auckland to the River Tees, passing through Darlington. That was 4 times longer than Hetton. The engineering challenges were proportionally greater. George surveyed the route in 1821, assisted by 18-year-old Robert. Father and son worked together, Robert handling the mathematical calculations, while George made the practical engineering decisions. The partnership that had begun with nightly homework sessions was now a professional collaboration. Construction started the same year. George supervised everything: the grading, the bridge construction, the track laying. He made decisions about gradients and curves based on his understanding of locomotive capabilities. The line had to be gentle enough for the engines to pull heavy loads, which meant extensive earthworks, cuttings through hills, embankments across valleys. But George had another problem. He needed locomotives. Reliable locomotives, better than anything currently available. He couldn't just buy them from someone else because nobody was building locomotives commercially. Each engine was custom-made for specific railways. So George decided to start a company. In 1823, he partnered with Edward Pease and others to form Robert Stephenson and Company, the world's first locomotive manufacturing business. They established works in Newcastle on 4th Street, with Robert as the managing partner. Robert was 20 years old. George had prepared him for exactly this role through years of education and hands-on experience. The son would handle the business and technical details of locomotive construction, while the father oversaw the railway projects that would use those locomotives. The first engine produced by the new company was called Locomotion. It was completed in the fall of 1825, just in time for the railway's opening, September 27th, 1825. That's the date everything changed. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened to massive public interest. Thousands of people lined the route to witness the spectacle. A man on horseback carrying a flag led the procession, the banner reading Periculum Privatum Utilitas Publica. Private danger is the public good. When the horsemen cleared the way, George Stephenson opened the throttle on Locomotion and started moving. Behind the engine, 6 wagons loaded with coal and flour, then the passenger coach experiment carrying important dignitaries, then 21 wagons fitted with temporary seats packed with workers and their families. 600 people in total. The train moved at 15 miles per hour. For comparison, a horse-drawn coach on good roads might average 8 to 10 miles per hour. This wasn't just faster, it was transformatively faster while carrying a load no horse team could manage. George guided Locomotion along the 9-mile track in just under 2 hours. The crowds cheered. The investors celebrated. The doubters, of whom there were many, fell silent. This wasn't a colliery demonstration or an experimental prototype. This was a functioning public railway, open to anyone who wanted to pay for transport. It carried goods and passengers reliably, safely, profitably. The technology worked, but there was one more detail from that opening day that would echo through history. George had made a decision about the track gauge, the distance between the rails. He'd chosen 4 feet 8.5 inches. Why that specific measurement? Because it was what worked. George had experimented and found that rails spaced 4 feet 8 inches apart caused wheels to bind slightly on curves. Moving each rail outward by a 1/4 inch solved the problem without requiring modifications to the locomotives. It was a tiny adjustment based on practical experience. That 1/4 inch decision would define global railway construction for the next 2 centuries. Approximately 60% of the world's railways still use that exact gauge today. Think about that. A decision made by a self-taught engineer in 1825 based on nothing more than watching wheels bind on curves and adjusting by a 1/4 inch became the global standard. Railways in North America, Europe, China, Australia, all running on tracks spaced 4 feet 8.5 inches apart because George Stephenson found it worked best for his locomotives. The Stockton and Darlington proved something the experts had doubted. Steam railways were practical, profitable, scalable. Within months, other railway schemes emerged across Britain. Investors who dismissed the idea as fantasy were now scrambling to fund new lines. George's services were suddenly in demand everywhere, but one project stood above all others: a railway connecting Liverpool and Manchester. These were 2 of Britain's most important commercial cities. Manchester was the heart of textile manufacturing, producing cloth in quantities that had never been possible before mechanisation. Liverpool was the port, the gateway to global trade. Cotton came in through Liverpool, got manufactured in Manchester, then shipped back through Liverpool to markets worldwide. The problem was transport between the 2 cities. 40 miles of terrible roads and an inadequate canal system that couldn't handle the volume. Moving goods took days, cost too much, created bottlenecks that limited growth. A group of Liverpool merchants proposed a railway. The idea met fierce resistance. Canal companies saw their monopoly threatened. Landowners didn't want trains crossing their estates. Some people genuinely believed high-speed travel would be dangerous, that travelling faster than horses would cause medical problems, that tunnels would suffocate passengers. The proposal went to Parliament in 1825 and got rejected. The opposition was too strong, the concerns too numerous, but the merchants persisted. They refined the proposal, addressed objections, lobbied relentlessly. In 1826, Parliament approved the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. George Stephenson was appointed chief engineer. This was different from Stockton and Darlington. That had been a colliery railway, primarily for freight, with modest expectations. Liverpool and Manchester was ambitious, designed for both heavy goods and passengers, intended to operate at scale. The technical challenges were enormous. The route had to be as level as possible because early locomotives struggled with gradients. But the terrain between Liverpool and Manchester wasn't cooperative. There were hills, valleys, rivers, and one obstacle that seemed insurmountable: Chat Moss. Chat Moss was a peat bog covering 12 square miles. The peat was 30 feet deep in places, a quagmire that had swallowed carts and horses. Building a railway across it seemed impossible. Engineers said it couldn't be done. The peat was too unstable. Any structure would simply sink. George disagreed. He'd dealt with difficult terrain before. His approach was methodical, experimental. He consulted with Robert Stannard, a specialist in marshland from East Anglia, who dealt with similar problems. Together they developed a solution. Instead of trying to reach solid ground beneath the bog, they'd float the railway on top. They laid a foundation of heather and branches, bound together, then covered it with tar and topped it with crushed stone. The weight was distributed across a wide area, preventing the structure from sinking. It worked. Slowly, section by section, the railway advanced across Chat Moss. The process took months of trial and error. Sometimes sections did sink and had to be rebuilt. Critics mocked the project, predicted total failure. George kept working. When one approach didn't work, he tried another. The problem wasn't whether Chat Moss could be crossed. It was finding the method that would work. By 1829, the railway was nearly complete. Bridges built, tunnels dug, Track laid across what everyone said was impossible terrain, but there was still the question of motive power. What would pull the trains? The railway company wasn't committed to steam locomotives. Some directors favoured stationary engines placed along the route, pulling trains with cables. Others thought horses might still be preferable. The debate went back and forth until the directors decided to settle it with a competition. The Rainhill Trials, held in October 1829. Any locomotive builder could enter, but the engines had to meet specific requirements. They needed to pull 3 times their own weight at 10 miles per hour, consume their own smoke to avoid polluting, and cost no more than £550. 5 locomotives entered. Most failed quickly. Cycloped was powered by a horse running on a treadmill, which violated the spirit if not the letter of the rules. It withdrew. Perseverance's engine broke before the trials began. Sans Pareil broke down during testing. Novelty was fast but mechanically fragile and couldn't complete the full distance. That left Rocket, built by Robert Stephenson at the Newcastle Works, to George's design. Robert had returned from South America in 1827 and taken over managing the locomotive company, while George focused on railway construction. The two stayed in constant communication through letters, George suggesting improvements, Robert implementing them. Rocket incorporated several innovations. Multiple fire tubes running through the boiler increased heating efficiency. A blast pipe directed exhaust steam up the chimney, creating draft that intensified the fire. The cylinders were positioned at an angle, improving power transmission. These weren't revolutionary concepts individually, but combined in one machine, optimized through testing, they made Rocket significantly more powerful and efficient than previous locomotives. During the Rainhill trials, Rocket ran back and forth along a prescribed course, pulling loads, maintaining speed, proving reliability. It reached 30 miles per hour on some runs, faster than any previous locomotive. The performance convinced the railway directors. Steam locomotives would power the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and those locomotives would come from Stephenson's works. The opening ceremony was scheduled for September 15th, 1830. This wasn't just another railway opening. The Liverpool and Manchester was the first intercity railway designed for both freight and passengers, the first to rely entirely on locomotives rather than horses or stationary engines. It represented everything George had been working toward for 15 years. The Duke of Wellington attended, along with numerous members of Parliament and other dignitaries. 8 locomotives were prepared for the inaugural run, all built in Newcastle at Stephenson's works. George drove Northumbrian, leading the procession. Robert drove Phoenix. The plan was to travel from Liverpool to Manchester, demonstrating the railway's capabilities to the assembled guests and massive crowds. Everything went perfectly until the train stopped at Parkside for water. William Huskisson, Member of Parliament for Liverpool, got out of his carriage to speak with the Duke of Wellington. He was standing on the track when Rocket, driven by Joseph Locke, approached on the adjacent line. Huskisson panicked, tried to climb back into Wellington's carriage, stumbled and fell into Rocket's path. The locomotive ran over his leg, crushing it. George took control immediately. He uncoupled Northumbrian from its train and used it to rush Huskisson to Eccles, 15 miles away, where doctors were waiting. Northumbrian covered the distance in 25 minutes, the fastest anyone had ever travelled overland, but the injury was too severe. Huskisson died that evening. The accident cast a shadow over what should have been a triumph. Critics pointed to it as proof that railways were dangerous. The opening ceremony continued in subdued fashion, but the celebration was muted. George felt the weight of it. The first railway passenger fatality on the line he'd built during the opening ceremony. Yet the railway itself proved spectacularly successful. Within weeks, public enthusiasm overcame the initial shock. Passengers flooded the line. The trains ran multiple times daily, carrying far more people than the company had projected. Freight followed, with goods moving between Liverpool and Manchester in hours instead of days. The railway made money from the start, validating everything George had argued about the commercial viability of steam transport. Other railway schemes immediately emerged. If Liverpool and Manchester could work, similar lines could connect other cities. Railway mania was beginning. Investors wanted to fund new projects, engineers wanted to build them, and everyone wanted George Stephenson. He became chief engineer for multiple railways simultaneously: the Manchester and Leeds Railway, the Birmingham and Derby Junction Railway, the North Midland Railway, the York and North Midland Railway. Each project required surveys, planning, solving unique engineering problems. George travelled constantly, moving from one site to another, overseeing construction, making decisions, training younger engineers. His reputation was now international. American railway builders came to Newcastle to learn from him and to buy locomotives from his works. The first locomotives operating in the United States were Stephenson engines. European engineers consulted him on their projects. He wasn't just building Britain's railway network, he was exporting the technology worldwide. But success brought new challenges. As more railways were built, questions emerged about how they'd connect. Different companies built lines to different specifications. Some used George's gauge, others didn't. Some used different rail profiles, different signalling systems, different loading gauges. If the goal was a national network, these incompatibilities created problems. George argued consistently for standardization. Use the same gauge everywhere, so trains could run across different companies' lines without transferring cargo. Use compatible equipment, so locomotives and rolling stock could move freely. Plan for integration from the start rather than building isolated systems. Not everyone agreed. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, another brilliant engineer, designed the Great Western Railway with a 7-foot gauge, arguing it provided better stability and speed. Other engineers made different choices based on local conditions or personal preferences. The result was a patchwork of systems that couldn't easily connect. Parliament eventually had to intervene. In 1846, they mandated that all new railways use the standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches, unless special circumstances justified deviation. Brunel's broad gauge survived for decades, but was eventually converted. George's practical choice made on a colliery line in the 1820s became law. The professional demands were relentless. George was in his 50s now, wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a young brakesman, but the work never stopped. New railways needed surveying. Parliament required testimony on proposed bills. The locomotive works needed oversight. Investors wanted consultations. Younger engineers sought mentorship. Robert had matured into a brilliant engineer in his own right, eventually surpassing his father in some technical areas. The relationship shifted. They were no longer teacher and student, but professional equals, collaborating on projects, debating solutions, pushing each other's thinking. What George had started by insisting his son receive proper education had created a partnership that advanced the entire field. George's personal life finally found some stability. In 1820, he'd married Betty Hindmarsh. Remember her? The farmer's daughter whose father had rejected George when he was a poor miner. Financial success had changed the father's opinion, and George and Betty married. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage, though they had no children. Betty understood George's work, supported his ambitions, managed the household while he travelled constantly for railway projects. The money allowed George to indulge interests beyond engineering. He bought Tapton House, near Chesterfield, in 1838, a gentleman's estate with extensive grounds. He invested in coal mines, ironworks, limestone quarries. The railways he built often revealed valuable mineral deposits, and George had the capital and knowledge to exploit them. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was a businessman, an industrialist, someone with genuine wealth and influence, but he never lost his fascination with practical problems. At Tapton House, he built elaborate hothouses in the gardens, growing exotic fruits and vegetables. This became almost an obsession, a different kind of engineering challenge. How to control temperature and humidity, what soil mixtures worked best, which cultivation techniques produced optimal results. Joseph Paxton, head gardener at nearby Chatsworth House, and one of Britain's most celebrated horticulturalists, became a friendly rival. They competed in growing competitions, comparing produce, sharing techniques, while trying to outdo each other. George won twice, beating the professional gardener at his own craft. The same determination that had driven him to master steam engines now pushed him to perfect pineapple cultivation. In 1847, George became the first president of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, newly formed to advance the profession he'd helped create. It was a recognition of his contributions, an acknowledgement that the self-taught colliery worker had fundamentally changed engineering. He'd proven that practical knowledge, systematically applied, could match or exceed what universities taught. But time was catching up. Betty died in 1845 after 25 years of marriage. George was 64, still active but slowing down. He married again in January 1848 to Ellen Gregory, his housekeeper. 7 months later, he contracted pleurisy. August 12, 1848. George Stephenson died at Tapton House, aged 67. He was buried at Holy Trinity Church in Chesterfield, next to Betty. The news spread quickly through Britain's engineering community. George Stephenson, the man who'd built the railways, was gone. Newspapers ran obituaries. Engineers who'd worked with him shared stories. Parliament members who'd sparred with him in committee hearings acknowledged his contributions. Even critics who'd fought against his methods admitted he'd changed the world. But here's what's strange about death and legacy. The man was buried, mourned, remembered. Yet most of what made him significant was just beginning to fully unfold. Railways in 1848 were established in Britain, spreading across Europe, starting to appear in America. But the true railway age, the era when trains would remake civilization itself, was still ahead. George died at the inflection point. He'd built the foundation, but wouldn't see the structure that rose from it. Robert took over the business, the locomotive works, the engineering consultancies, the ongoing projects. Father and son had been partners for years. Now Robert stood alone, carrying forward work they'd pioneered together. He'd already achieved things George hadn't, designing bridges and structures that pushed beyond what his father could envision. The younger Stephenson would become even more famous than his father in some circles, but he never forgot where the knowledge originated. Every innovation Robert made built on principles George had discovered through trial and error in colliery workshops. The railway boom exploded in the 1850s and 60s. Lines spread across Britain like veins, connecting every major city, reaching into rural areas, transforming how people lived and worked. The pattern repeated globally. European nations built networks, copying British designs. American railroads pushed west, using locomotives purchased from or modelled after Stephenson's engines. India, Australia, South America, Africa. Everywhere European influence reached, railways followed. And most of those railways used the standard gauge George had established back on the Stockton and Darlington line. Think about what that means practically. A decision made in the 1820s based on colliery wagon widths became infrastructure determining how billions of tons of freight and millions of passengers would move for the next 2 centuries. George wasn't thinking about global implications when he chose 4 feet 8.5 inches. He was solving an immediate problem: keep the gauge compatible with existing mine railways while allowing smooth curves. The long-term consequences were accidental but irreversible. The gauge wars proved this. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, brilliant engineer and George's contemporary, believed wider gauge was superior. He built the Great Western Railway using 7-foot gauge, arguing it allowed faster speeds and more stability. Technically, he was right. Brunel's broad gauge trains performed better than standard gauge equivalents. But Brunel was wrong about what mattered. Technical superiority meant nothing if your railway couldn't connect with anyone else's. The Great Western became an island, incompatible with the growing network around it. Eventually, decades later, it was converted to standard gauge. George's practical choice beat Brunel's engineered perfection because compatibility trumps optimization. This pattern repeated everywhere railways spread. Some nations initially chose different gauges. Russia went wider, thinking it would prevent invasion. Spain and Portugal picked Iberian gauge. But international trade required standardization. Goods crossing borders needed to stay on the same trains. Standard gauge kept winning not through technical merit, but through network effects. The more railways used it, the more new railways had to use it. George's choice became locked in, self-reinforcing, irreversible. The safety lamp story also evolved after his death. The Davy versus Stephenson controversy had been bitter while both men lived. Davy died in 1829, convinced until the end that George had stolen his idea. But miners knew better. They'd used both lamps. The Geordie lamp and the Davy lamp worked on similar principles, but had different designs. Miners in Northumberland preferred George's version. It was sturdier, easier to maintain, better suited to actual working conditions. The scientific establishment might have credited Davy, but the people who depended on safety lamps daily chose Stephenson's design. A House of Commons committee investigated the matter in 1833 and concluded both men had invented their lamps independently. George had equal claim to the innovation. This should have settled the question, but reputations are stubborn things. Davy remained the celebrated scientist, George the practical mechanic, who maybe, possibly, had stumbled onto the same solution through luck rather than genius. The class prejudice that had dogged George his entire career didn't disappear at his death. Yet practical results spoke louder than credentials. Mines using Geordie lamps had fewer explosions. The design improvements George had made, small modifications based on field testing rather than theory, actually worked better in real conditions. Science and engineering aren't the same thing. Scientists discover principles, engineers solve problems. George was always an engineer first, and the proof was in the machinery that worked. The railways that ran, the lamps that kept miners alive. The fortune George left behind demonstrated how far he'd come from that cottage in Wylam. He owned Tapton House and its extensive grounds. He held shares in multiple coal mines, ironworks, and limestone quarries. The locomotive works in Newcastle, though Robert now managed it, generated continuing revenue. Property investments, railway shares, mineral rights. The exact value is difficult to calculate in modern terms, but George died a wealthy man by any measure. The boy who'd herded cows for pennies left an estate that secured his family's future. His will showed characteristic generosity. He'd financially supported families of workers who died in accidents throughout his career. Men injured building his railways received ongoing assistance. Widows and orphans of employees were provided for. This wasn't legally required. Victorian Britain had no workers' compensation laws, no social safety net. George chose to take responsibility, recognising that his success had been built partly on others' labour and sacrifice. Some had literally died building his railways. He made sure their families didn't starve. The institution of mechanical engineers, which George had presided over in 1847, became increasingly important after his death. It established engineering as a distinct profession, separate from general mechanics or theoretical science. The institution created standards, shared best practices, trained new engineers. It formalized what George had done informally throughout his career, mentoring younger men, sharing hard-won knowledge, advancing the field through collaboration rather than competition. Well, mostly, George had certainly competed when necessary, But he'd also recognised that raising overall standards helped everyone. His reputation went through phases. Immediately after death, he was celebrated as a hero of industry, a self-made man who transformed Britain through determination and practical skill. The Victorians loved that narrative. It fit their ideology perfectly. Hard work and native intelligence could elevate anyone, regardless of birth. George proved the system worked. Never mind that most working-class people didn't have his opportunities or that luck had played a significant role. The mythology was more useful than the messy reality. By the late 1800s, as railways became ubiquitous and taken for granted, George's reputation faded somewhat. Newer engineers like Brunel received more attention. The dramatic failures and successes of later projects seemed more exciting than the foundational work George had done. Building the first railway is historically significant but less visually spectacular than building massive bridges or tunnelling through mountains. Robert's achievements sometimes overshadowed his father's pioneering efforts. The 20th century brought reassessment. Historians examining the Industrial Revolution's origins recognised George's crucial role. He hadn't just built railways. He'd proven they could work commercially, not just technically. The Stockton and Darlington showed that steam locomotives could move freight profitably. The Liverpool and Manchester demonstrated that passenger traffic could generate revenue exceeding even optimistic projections. These weren't scientific discoveries. They were business models that transformed how capitalism itself functioned. Railways enabled mass production by solving the distribution problem. Factories could manufacture goods in unprecedented quantities because railways could move those goods to distant markets quickly and cheaply. Raw materials could be brought in from farther away. Workers could live farther from factories and commute. Cities could grow beyond walking distance from their centres. The entire spatial organisation of industrial society depended on railways, and railways depended on the foundation George had built. Consider the timeline. George was born in 1781, when Britain was still primarily agricultural, when most people lived in villages, when transportation meant horses or boats. He died in 1848, when railways crisscrossed the nation, when industrial cities dominated the economy, when steam power was transforming manufacturing. That transformation happened within one lifetime. George didn't cause all of it, obviously, but he'd been instrumental in the transportation revolution that enabled everything else. His self-education story became almost mythical. The illiterate brakesman who taught himself to read at 18, who studied machinery in his spare time, who rose through sheer determination to become Britain's most sought-after engineer. It's inspirational, genuinely so, but it also obscures important context. George had opportunities, many didn't. His father's position as an engine fireman gave young George access to machinery. His promotion to engine wright came because the colliery needed someone with his skills. His early locomotives were built because mine owners were willing to fund experiments. Individual talent mattered, but so did being in the right place when technology was advancing rapidly and capital was available for innovation. The educational part, though, that was real and remarkable, teaching himself arithmetic well enough to perform engineering calculations, learning through practice and observation what university-trained engineers learned from textbooks, developing an intuitive understanding of mechanics through hands-on experience with actual machinery. This wasn't inferior to formal education. It was different, with distinct advantages and limitations. George could solve practical problems that stumped theoretically trained engineers because he understood how machines actually behaved, not just how they should behave according to principles. But he struggled with abstract mathematics and theoretical physics that would have been second nature to someone with university training. The partnership with Robert balanced this perfectly. Robert had the formal education George lacked. He could do the theoretical calculations, design complex structures, engage with scientific principles. But Robert also had George's practical training, having worked alongside his father from youth. The combination of George's empirical knowledge and Robert's theoretical understanding created something neither could have achieved alone. The rocket wasn't just George's design or Robert's. It was collaborative work that merged two different types of expertise. Britain's railway network in the decades after George's death vindicated every argument he'd made. The standardisation he'd fought for proved essential. The practical approach he'd championed, building what worked rather than what theory suggested should work, became engineering orthodoxy. The apprenticeship system he'd used to train engineers became the model for mechanical engineering education, even as universities started offering formal programs. The locomotive works in Newcastle that George and Robert had founded became one of the world's premier engineering firms. It supplied locomotives globally, trained generations of engineers, advanced the technology continuously. Other firms emerged, competition developed, but the Stephenson works maintained its reputation for quality and innovation. The standards George had established, the attention to practical detail, the willingness to experiment and improve, these became company culture that persisted long after his death. His influence on American railroads deserves particular attention. The first locomotives used in the United States were imported from Stephenson's works. American engineers came to Newcastle to study his methods. The standard gauge was adopted partly because American railroads wanted compatibility with British technology and expertise. As American manufacturing developed and domestic locomotive production began, the designs were based heavily on Stephenson's models. The entire trajectory of American railway development was shaped by templates George had created. This wasn't colonialism or cultural imperialism in the usual sense. Americans weren't forced to use British railway technology. They chose it because it worked, because it was proven, because adopting established standards was faster and cheaper than developing everything independently. The network effects kicked in early. Once the first American railways used standard gauge and Stephenson-style locomotives, subsequent railways had strong incentives to follow the same pattern. George never visited America. He never saw the vast distances American railways would eventually cover, never witnessed how the technology he'd pioneered would enable westward expansion and continental integration. But his influence crossed the Atlantic anyway, carried by engineers who'd studied his methods and locomotives built to his designs. The Continental Railways told a similar story. Belgium's first railway, opened in 1835, used locomotives from Newcastle and adopted standard gauge. German states building railways in the 1830s and 1840s followed the same pattern. French engineers studied Stephenson's methods before constructing their own networks. Even Russia, whose vast distances and harsh climate presented unique challenges, built its first railways using principles George had established. The technology proved adaptable across wildly different contexts. What's striking is how quickly this happened. George built the Stockton and Darlington in 1825. Within 20 years, railways were spreading across 3 continents. Within 40 years, networks spanned thousands of miles. The pace of adoption was unprecedented for such a complex technology. Previous transportation innovations, canals for instance, had taken centuries to develop and spread. Railways went from experimental curiosity to global infrastructure in a single generation. Part of this speed came from standardization. Engineers didn't need to reinvent everyday bottlenecks that traditional methods couldn't solve. Roads were inadequate, canals were too slow and geographically limited. Railways solved problems that were becoming critical to economic development. George's later years saw him transition from working engineer to consulting expert and businessman. By the 1830s, he was wealthy enough to invest in ventures beyond railways. He bought coal mines in Derbyshire, recognising that railway construction often revealed valuable mineral deposits. The tunnelling and excavation required for laying track exposed coal seams that could then be exploited commercially. This wasn't insider trading exactly, but it was leveraging knowledge gained through engineering work for personal profit. He invested in ironworks, understanding that railway expansion would drive massive demand for iron rails. He bought limestone quarries, knowing lime was essential for construction and agriculture. These investments showed business acumen that matched his engineering talent. George wasn't just building railways, he was building wealth through strategic positioning in the industries railways would stimulate. In 1838, he purchased Tapton House near Chesterfield. This wasn't a modest cottage, it was a gentleman's estate with substantial grounds. George was now living as landed gentry, a remarkable transformation from the cottage at Wylam where he'd been born. The house had extensive gardens, which became George's new obsession. He built hothouses for growing exotic plants, experimented with horticulture, competed with professional gardeners in producing prize specimens. This might seem trivial, a rich man's hobby, but it reveals something about George's character. He approached gardening the same way he'd approached locomotives, through experimentation, observation, learning by doing. He wasn't content to hire gardeners and admire the results. He wanted to understand the principles, master the techniques, compete with the best. His rivalry with Joseph Paxton, head gardener at Chatsworth House, and later designer of the Crystal Palace, became local legend. George reportedly beat Paxton in horticultural competitions twice, victories he treasured as much as engineering triumphs. His personal life during these years was marked by both stability and loss. In 1820, now considerably wealthier than when he'd first courted her, George married Betty Hindmarsh. This was the same woman whose father had rejected him as unsuitable decades earlier when he was a poor miner. The marriage was apparently happy, though they had no children. Betty died in 1845, leaving George widowed again after 25 years together. The loss of Betty affected him deeply. She'd been part of his life from youth, a connection to his origins even as his circumstances transformed. Her death came as George was already withdrawing from active engineering work, transitioning into advisory roles and managing his investments. The combination of personal loss and professional change marked a shift toward his final years. In 1847, George became the first president of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, a professional organisation established to advance the field he'd done so much to create. This was recognition by his peers, an acknowledgement that despite lacking formal credentials, George had become the elder statesman of mechanical engineering. His presidential address emphasised practical knowledge over theoretical training, unsurprisingly, given his own background. The grave is still there, marked with a monument that identifies him simply as George Stephenson, engineer. His will revealed the extent of his wealth. He left substantial sums to family members, established funds for dependents of workers who died in railway accidents or mining disasters, made bequests to various causes. The generosity was characteristic. Despite accumulating significant wealth, George never forgot his origins or the precariousness of working-class life. He supported families who'd lost breadwinners, understanding from personal experience what such loss meant. The obituaries were extensive, recognising his contributions while also revealing lingering class prejudices. Some praised his genius while noting his lack of formal education, as if it were a handicap overcome, rather than simply irrelevant. Others focused on his business success, treating the engineering achievements as means to wealth rather than ends in themselves. The most perceptive observers recognised that George had fundamentally changed how Britain, and increasingly the world, moved people and goods. Robert continued the work, becoming an even more prominent engineer than his father in some ways. His bridges, including the high-level bridge in Newcastle and the Britannia Bridge in Wales, were engineering marvels that surpassed George's achievements in structural ambition. But Robert always acknowledged that everything he'd accomplished built on foundations his father had laid. The partnership had been genuine, the collaboration real, even as their individual contributions were sometimes difficult to separate. The Stephenson locomotive works in Newcastle continued operating for decades, producing engines for railways worldwide. The company maintained its reputation for quality and innovation, training new generations of engineers, advancing the technology continuously. By the late 19th century, as railway construction reached its peak, thousands of Stephenson locomotives were operating across 6 continents. The company had become synonymous with railway engineering excellence. The gauge standardization George had fought for proved its value repeatedly as networks expanded. When railways from different companies met and needed to connect, standard gauge meant interoperability. Passengers and freight could transfer between lines without changing trains. This seems obvious now, but it required foresight in the 1820s, when each company wanted autonomy, and some engineers argued for different gauges, optimized for different purposes. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, perhaps the only British engineer whose reputation eventually matched Stephenson's, made exactly this mistake. Brunel designed the Great Western Railway with a 7-foot gauge, arguing it would allow higher speeds and smoother rides. He was probably right technically. Broad gauge did offer advantages, but it created incompatibility with the rest of Britain's network, requiring passengers to change trains and freight to be transferred at gauge breaks. The inconvenience eventually forced conversion to standard gauge, decades later at enormous expense. George had understood that network effects mattered more than individual optimization. A slightly less efficient gauge that everyone used was vastly superior to a theoretically perfect gauge that created fragmentation. This systems level thinking, this recognition that railways were infrastructure rather than isolated projects, was one of his most important contributions. The safety lamp controversy never fully resolved during George's lifetime. Humphrey Davy went to his grave in 1829, convinced that Stephenson had stolen his invention. The scientific establishment largely sided with Davy, while northern mining communities championed George. Parliament eventually ruled that both men had developed the lamp independently, which was probably accurate. The fact that 2 people working on the same problem reached similar solutions simultaneously wasn't surprising, but the class dynamics made it controversial in ways a purely technical dispute wouldn't have been. George's distrust of theoretical experts, which this controversy reinforced, occasionally led him astray. He dismissed some valid scientific criticisms of his designs, assuming that educated critics simply didn't understand practical realities. Sometimes he was right. Often theoretical objections proved irrelevant in actual operation. But occasionally, the experts had legitimate points that George's stubbornness prevented him from acknowledging until experience proved them correct. This tension between practical and theoretical knowledge runs through George's entire career. He demonstrated that formal education wasn't necessary for engineering achievement, but he also showed the limitations of purely empirical approaches. The ideal, which his partnership with Robert exemplified, was combining both types of knowledge: theory informed by practice, practice guided by theory. The speed at which George worked sometimes led to mistakes. Several of his early bridges required strengthening or replacement within years of construction. Some tunnel alignments proved suboptimal and needed modification. He occasionally underestimated challenges, promising completion dates that proved unrealistic. These weren't catastrophic failures, but they were real problems that better theoretical grounding might have prevented. Yet the overall record remains extraordinary. The Stockton and Darlington, the Liverpool and Manchester, the dozens of other lines he surveyed or built, these worked. They moved millions of passengers and millions of tons of freight. They transformed the British economy and provided templates that reshaped global transportation. The occasional error or needed modification was trivial compared to the fundamental achievement. George's influence on railway engineering extended beyond specific technical innovations. He established expectations for what engineers should do, how they should approach problems, what standards they should maintain. The idea that an engineer was responsible for the entire system, not just individual components, came largely from his example. Previous engineers might design a bridge or a tunnel. George designed complete railways, from surveying the route to training the operators. This comprehensive approach became the model for subsequent infrastructure projects. When later engineers built canals, roads, telegraph lines, electrical grids, they followed the Stephenson pattern of end-to-end system design. The professional identity of the civil engineer, someone who took responsibility for complex, integrated projects, evolved from practices George had established. His legacy in education was equally significant despite, or perhaps because of, his own lack of formal training. The articled apprenticeship system he'd used to train Robert and other young engineers became standard in mechanical engineering. Young men learned by working alongside experienced practitioners, gradually taking on more responsibility, eventually becoming masters themselves. This was combined with evening classes in mathematics and technical drawing, creating a hybrid model that balanced practical and theoretical knowledge. When universities eventually began offering engineering degrees in the late 19th century, they incorporated much of this apprenticeship approach. Laboratory work, practical projects, industrial placements. These became standard components of engineering education precisely because people recognized that theoretical knowledge alone was insufficient. George had proven that practical experience mattered, and educational institutions adjusted accordingly. The economic impact of his work is difficult to overstate. Railways reduced transportation costs by roughly 80% compared to road haulage. This made previously non-viable industries suddenly profitable. Coal could be moved from mines to cities cheaply enough that steam power became economical for manufacturing. Fresh food could reach urban markets before spoiling, improving nutrition and public health. Raw materials could flow to factories and finished goods to customers at speeds and costs that enabled mass production. Britain's industrial dominance in the mid-19th century rested substantially on railway infrastructure that George had pioneered. The ability to move goods and people quickly and cheaply gave British manufacturers advantages that sustained economic leadership for decades. Other nations recognized this and rushed to build their own railways, often using British technology and expertise, spreading the economic transformation globally. Social transformation followed economic change. Railways didn't just move goods faster, they moved people in ways that shattered centuries of geographic isolation. A farm labourer in Yorkshire could board a train and be in London within hours. This was revolutionary in ways difficult to comprehend now. For most of human history, people lived and died within walking distance of their birthplace. The railway made mobility possible for ordinary people, not just the wealthy. This had profound effects on labour markets. Workers could migrate to areas with better opportunities. Employers faced competition for labour from distant regions. Wage disparities between areas began to equalise. Information spread faster too. Newspapers could be distributed nationally on the same day they were printed. Ideas that might have taken weeks to travel from London to Edinburgh now arrived within hours. Cultural homogenisation accelerated. Regional dialects began to fade as people travelled and mixed. Local customs encountered alternatives. The railway created a more unified national consciousness, for better and worse. It also enabled leisure travel for the middle class. Day trips to the seaside, visits to relatives in distant cities, Tourism to historic sites all became accessible to people who previously couldn't afford such journeys. George's personal life during these transformative years was marked by both success and loss. In 1820, now considerably wealthier than when he'd first courted her, George married Betty Hindmarsh at Newburn Church. This was the same Betty whose father had rejected George as unsuitable when he was a poor miner. Financial success had transformed his social standing, allowing him to finally marry the woman he'd met secretly in her father's orchard decades earlier. The marriage lasted 25 years, and by all accounts was happy, though they had no children. Betty died in 1845, another significant loss for George, who had already buried his first wife Frances and their infant daughter. The pattern of George's personal losses stands in stark contrast to his professional triumphs. As he built infrastructure that would outlast him by centuries, the people closest to him kept disappearing. By the late 1830s, George was not only Britain's leading railway engineer, but also a successful businessman. Profits from his contracts and locomotive works allowed him to invest in coal, iron and limestone. When tunnelling for the North Midland Railway revealed coal seams, George put money into their exploitation. His business acumen matched his engineering genius, parlaying railway earnings into successful investments in extractive industries. In 1838, he purchased Tapton House near Chesterfield, where he would live for the rest of his life. The estate symbolised how far he'd come from that cottage beside the Wylam Wagonway, where he'd been born in poverty. Tapton House allowed George to live as a gentleman while remaining closely involved with technical work, advising Parliament on railway bills and mentoring younger engineers. At Tapton House, George discovered a passion that surprised many who knew him only as an engineer. He became an enthusiastic gardener, building hothouses in the estate gardens where he grew exotic fruits and vegetables. This wasn't casual hobby gardening. George approached horticulture with the same competitive intensity he'd brought to railway engineering. His neighbour Joseph Paxton was head gardener at Chatsworth House, one of the most celebrated gardeners in Britain. George entered into what was described as a not too friendly rivalry with Paxton. Remarkably, George twice defeated the professional gardener in horticultural competitions. The same determination and attention to detail that had made him successful in railways applied equally to cultivating pineapples and grapes. This competitive gardening reveals something about George's character. He didn't retire into comfortable complacency. Even in his 60s, he needed challenges, needed to test himself against the best in any field he entered. The fact that he could compete successfully with a professional gardener while also advising on railway projects across Britain demonstrates formidable energy and focus. In 1847, George became the first president of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers on its formation. This was recognition from his professional peers, acknowledgement that he'd not just built railways, but had helped create an entire profession. The institution would outlive him, continuing to set standards and advance mechanical engineering long after its founding president was gone. By this time, George had settled into semi-retirement, supervising his mining interests in Derbyshire, while younger engineers took on new railway projects. He'd trained many of them, either directly or through the example of his work. His influence extended through multiple generations of engineers who'd learned from studying his methods. The man who transformed how the world moved was laid to rest in a quiet churchyard, far from the railways that bore his stamp. George's generosity extended beyond his lifetime through provisions in his will. He financially supported the wives and families of several men who had died in his employment, whether from accident, misadventure, or other causes. Some were family, others not. This sense of responsibility toward his workers' dependents was unusual for the era, reflecting values formed during his own experience of poverty and loss. The railway he pioneered continued expanding after his death. By 1850, Britain had over 6,000 miles of track. By 1900, over 18,000. The network George had helped create became the circulatory system of industrial Britain, carrying the coal, iron, manufactured goods, and people that made Victorian prosperity possible. His son Robert continued the work, becoming an even more celebrated engineer than his father. Robert built railways across the world, from Egypt to Canada. The Stephenson firm Robert inherited became the premier locomotive manufacturer globally. But Robert never forgot that he'd learned the fundamentals at his father's side, working through mathematics homework together in the evenings after George's long days in the colliery. The standard gauge George had established, 4 feet 8.5 inches, became dominant worldwide. Today, approximately 60% of the world's railways use Stephenson gauge. This might be George's most enduring legacy, a technical standard chosen pragmatically that shaped global infrastructure for 2 centuries. Every time a train runs on standard gauge track anywhere in the world, it's using dimensions George settled on through trial and error at Killingworth. The influence extended beyond railways into broader industrial culture. George had demonstrated that formal education wasn't prerequisite for engineering achievement. This opened the profession to talented individuals from working-class backgrounds who might otherwise have been excluded. The apprenticeship system he'd used, combining practical experience with evening study, became standard for training engineers throughout the 19th century. Universities eventually began offering engineering degrees, but they incorporated much of George's apprenticeship approach. Laboratory work, practical projects, industrial placements, these became standard components precisely because the profession recognised that theoretical knowledge alone was insufficient. George had proven that hands-on experience mattered, and educational institutions adjusted accordingly. The economic impact of railways on British development is difficult to overstate. Transportation costs dropped by roughly 80% compared to road haulage. Industries previously limited by transport expenses suddenly became viable. Coal could move from mines to cities cheaply enough that steam power became economical for all manufacturing. Fresh food reached urban markets before spoiling, improving nutrition and public health. Britain's industrial dominance in the mid-19th century rested substantially on railway infrastructure. The ability to move goods and people quickly and cheaply gave British manufacturers advantages that sustained economic leadership for decades. Other nations recognised this and rushed to build their own railways, often using British technology and expertise, spreading the economic transformation globally. American railroad builders came to Newcastle to learn from the Stephenson shops. The first dozen or so locomotives used in America were purchased directly from George's company. His methods for surveying routes, constructing roadbeds, and operating railways were studied and replicated across continents. The global railway boom of the mid-19th century was essentially the worldwide adoption of techniques George had pioneered. Critics who doubted him were proven wrong by events. The theoretical engineers who'd claimed Chapmos was impassable, the parliamentary committees who'd questioned whether locomotives could handle gradients, the investors who'd thought railways would never compete with canals, all were refuted by operating railways that worked exactly as George had promised they would. This vindication came at a cost. George never forgot the condescension he'd faced from educated elites, the assumption that an uneducated man couldn't possibly understand complex engineering problems. The safety lamp controversy with Humphrey Davy had crystallized this class prejudice, and it colored George's relationships with theoretical scientists for the rest of his life. Yet George's legacy transcended these personal conflicts. The railways he built continued operating long after everyone involved in their construction had died. The Liverpool and Manchester line is still in use today, nearly 200 years after its opening. Modern trains run on routes George surveyed, through cuttings and over embankments he designed, using gauge dimensions he established. In 2002, a BBC poll named the 100 Greatest Britons. George Stephenson placed at number 65, ahead of many monarchs, generals, and politicians. The centenary of his birth in 1881 was celebrated at Crystal Palace by 15,000 people. Between 1990 and 2003, George's portrait appeared on the British £5 note, recognition that his contribution to national prosperity warranted permanent commemoration. These honours acknowledged not just technical achievement, but social transformation. George had risen from illiteracy and poverty to reshape the world's infrastructure. He'd proven that talent and determination could overcome the barriers of class and education. This narrative resonated powerfully in Victorian Britain and continues to inspire. The railway age George inaugurated lasted roughly a century before automobiles and aircraft began to dominate transportation. But railways never disappeared. Today, high-speed rail networks are expanding globally, carrying passengers at speeds George could never have imagined, but using principles he established. The basic technology, steel wheels on steel rails, remains fundamentally unchanged from what he perfected at Killingworth. What made George's achievement possible? Part of it was timing. He came of age precisely when steam engine technology was mature enough for mobile applications, but before anyone had successfully demonstrated railway viability. The opportunity existed for someone with the right combination of skills and determination to seize it. Part was personality, George's relentless drive to improve and perfect, his willingness to learn from failure, his ability to inspire confidence in investors and workers. These personal qualities were as important as his technical knowledge. Different personality, different outcome, even with identical technical skills. Part was context. Britain's industrial revolution created demand for better transportation. Capital was available for investment. The legal and financial infrastructure existed to organise large projects. Political stability allowed long-term planning. George's genius found fertile ground because conditions were right for railways to flourish. But fundamentally, it was George himself. Thousands of people lived through the same era with similar opportunities. Only George built the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Only George established standard gauge. Only George trained the generation of engineers who would build railways worldwide. Individual agency mattered, and George exercised it with extraordinary effect. His story demonstrates that expertise can develop through unconventional paths. The assumption that important innovations require formal credentials was proven false by someone who learned to read at 18. This challenges comfortable narratives about how knowledge is created and validated. George succeeded despite the educational establishment, not because of it, forcing recognition that practical intelligence can match or exceed theoretical training. The question is whether George's lack of formal training was incidental or essential to his success. Would university education have helped or hindered? The traditional view celebrates his triumph over educational disadvantage, but there's another interpretation worth considering. Formal engineering education in the 1810s and 1820s emphasized theoretical principles, mathematical rigor, classical mechanics. Students learned what was supposed to work according to established theory. George learned what actually worked through trial and error. When theory and practice conflicted, the university man trusted theory. George trusted his observations. This difference manifested repeatedly throughout his career. The Chatmoss crossing exemplifies it perfectly. Engineers with formal training declared it impossible based on calculations about soil mechanics and foundation requirements. George ignored the calculations and experimented with different approaches until something worked. His solution, floating the railway on bundled heather and branches, violated theoretical principles but functioned perfectly. The same pattern appeared with locomotive design. Theoretical engineers calculated optimal boiler pressures, piston arrangements, and wheel configurations based on thermodynamic principles. George built engines, tested them, modified what didn't work, and kept what did. The rocket's success came from empirical refinement, not theoretical optimization. Robert contributed more systematic analysis, having received formal education, but the fundamental approach remained experimental. George's later years reveal a man who'd achieved everything he'd sought and discovered that success brought its own complications. By the late 1830s, he was wealthy, famous, and in constant demand. Railway promoters across Britain and Europe wanted his expertise. American engineers travelled to Newcastle to learn from him. His advice commanded premium fees, but the work was exhausting. Every railway project involved years of surveying, planning, construction supervision, and political manoeuvring. Parliamentary committees required testimony. Investors demanded reassurance. Contractors needed management. George was approaching 60, and the pace was becoming unsustainable. In 1838, he purchased Tapton House near Chesterfield in Derbyshire. The estate provided him with what he'd never had before: leisure and space to pursue interests beyond railways. He'd always been fascinated by natural processes, by how things grew and developed. Now he had resources to indulge that curiosity. George became a gentleman farmer, experimenting with livestock breeding and crop cultivation. He built hothouses in the estate gardens, growing exotic fruits and vegetables. This wasn't casual gardening. George applied the same systematic approach he'd used with locomotives, testing different techniques, keeping detailed records, always seeking improvement. His neighbour was Joseph Paxton, head gardener at Chatsworth House and one of Britain's most celebrated horticulturalists. The two developed a friendly rivalry. George took particular satisfaction in twice defeating Paxton in horticultural competitions, proving that even in domains where Paxton was the acknowledged expert, determination and careful observation could produce superior results. This competitive gardening seems almost comical, given the magnitude of George's engineering achievements, but it reveals something important about his personality. He needed challenges, needed to be testing himself against high standards. Railways had become routine. Horticulture offered new problems to solve. George's personal life in these years showed similar patterns of loss and resilience. His second wife, Betty Hindmarsh, whom he'd finally married after becoming wealthy enough to be acceptable to her family, died in 1845. They'd been married 25 years, and her death left George alone again at 64. He didn't remain solitary long. On January 11th, 1848, at St. Chad's Church in Shrewsbury, George married Ellen Gregory, his housekeeper at Tapton House. Ellen was considerably younger, another farmer's daughter from Bakewell in Derbyshire. The marriage suggests George's continued need for companionship and domestic stability, but he had only months left. In the summer of 1848, George contracted pleurisy, an inflammation of the lung lining. At 67, weakened by decades of physically demanding work and exposure to coal dust and locomotive smoke, his body couldn't fight the infection. He died at noon on Saturday, August 12th, 1848, at Tapton House. George was buried at Holy Trinity Church in Chesterfield, alongside Betty. The funeral was well attended, but relatively modest given his achievements. He'd never sought grand gestures or public celebration. The work had been its own reward. His will revealed character through its details. George left substantial bequests to family members and former colleagues. More tellingly, he provided financial support for the widows and families of men who died in his employment, whether through accidents or other causes. This generosity extended beyond immediate family to anyone he felt had been left vulnerable by tragedy. This sense of responsibility toward workers was unusual for the era. Most industrial employers considered workplace deaths unfortunate but inevitable, requiring no compensation beyond perhaps a small funeral expense. George's different approach reflected his own working-class origins and the precariousness he'd experienced. He remembered what it meant to struggle, and he used his wealth to ease that struggle for others. The immediate impact of George's death was minimal. Railways continued expanding. His methods remained standard practice. Robert carried on the family business, completing projects George had initiated and taking on new ones. The institution of mechanical engineers, which George had helped found and served as first president, continued promoting engineering knowledge. But over subsequent decades, George's reputation evolved in interesting ways. During his lifetime, he'd been respected as a practical engineer, someone who got things done. After his death, he became something more symbolic. The self-made man who transformed the world through talent and determination. Victorian Britain particularly embraced this narrative. The 19th century was obsessed with stories of individual advancement through merit and hard work. George's life provided the perfect exemplar. Born in poverty and ignorance, he'd educated himself, mastered complex technology, and died wealthy and honoured. The story validated core Victorian beliefs about progress and social mobility. This celebratory interpretation wasn't entirely false, but it simplified a more complex reality. George had indeed risen through ability and effort, but he'd also benefited from specific historical circumstances. Had he been born 50 years earlier, before steam engine technology matured, his mechanical talents would have found more limited application. Had he been born into genuine destitution rather than working-class stability, education might have been impossible regardless of ambition. Timing mattered. So did geography. Being in northeast England during the Industrial Revolution's intensification, surrounded by coal mines and emerging machinery, provided opportunities that wouldn't have existed elsewhere. George seized those opportunities brilliantly, but they had to exist first. The 20th century brought more critical assessments. Historians began examining the social costs of railway development, the workers who died during construction, the communities displaced by route planning, the environmental damage from coal-powered locomotives. George's achievements looked more ambiguous when viewed through this lens. Modern engineering historians also questioned the extent of George's technical innovation. Many elements of railway technology predated him. Richard Trevithick had built steam locomotives before George started. Others had experimented with flanged wheels and track systems. George's contribution was synthesizing existing ideas and proving their commercial viability, not inventing entirely new principles. This doesn't diminish his importance. Synthesis and implementation matter enormously. The gap between theoretical possibility and practical reality is vast, and crossing it requires different skills than pure invention. George excelled at taking fragmentary ideas and making them work reliably at scale. That's engineering genius, even if it's not scientific discovery. The standard gauge question illustrates this perfectly. George didn't calculate the optimal track width through mathematical analysis. He tried different dimensions, noticed that 4 feet 8.5 inches reduced wheel binding on curves, and standardized that measurement. It was empirical, pragmatic, and ultimately correct. The fact that most of the world's railways use this gauge validates the approach. What would George make of modern railways? High-speed trains travelling at 300 kilometers per hour, electric locomotives, computerized signalling systems, the Channel Tunnel connecting Britain to continental Europe. The technology has evolved beyond anything he imagined, yet the fundamental principle remains his: steel wheels on steel rails, following fixed routes, moving people and goods efficiently. The environmental calculation has shifted. In George's era, railways were dramatically cleaner than alternative transportation. Horses produced enormous quantities of waste. Early roads were muddy, dangerous, and limited in capacity. Railways seem like unambiguous progress. Today, With climate change concerns, the carbon emissions from diesel locomotives look problematic. Yet railways remain more efficient than automobiles or aircraft for many purposes, and electric trains powered by renewable energy could fulfill George's vision while addressing modern environmental challenges. George's legacy extends beyond physical infrastructure into social and economic structures. The railway age created new occupations: engineers, conductors, station masters, track maintenance workers. It enabled suburban development, allowing people to live far from workplaces. It facilitated mass tourism, letting working-class families visit seaside resorts and distant cities. It connected regions, breaking down local isolation and creating more integrated national economies. These changes weren't always positive. Railway development concentrated economic power in fewer hands. The demand for coal to fuel locomotives accelerated mining expansion with its attendant dangers and environmental destruction. The ability to move troops rapidly by rail made warfare more devastating. Technology creates possibilities. Humans determine their application. George understood this implicitly. He'd seen technology's double edge in the coal mines, where steam engines both enabled deeper extraction and created new hazards. His safety lamp invention attempted to mitigate danger even while accepting that mining would continue. He never expressed utopian beliefs that railways would solve all problems. They were tools, useful for specific purposes, requiring careful management. The final assessment depends on what question you're asking. Did George Stephenson invent the railway? No. Multiple people contributed to its development. Did he make railways practical and commercially viable? Absolutely. Did he foresee all consequences of the transportation revolution he helped create? Of course not. Did his personal qualities of determination, practical intelligence, and systematic problem-solving matter enormously? Without question. A man born in 1781 in a cottage beside a horse-drawn wagonway died in 1848, having transformed how the entire world moved. That transformation continues today, every time a train departs a station, anywhere on Earth. The boy who learned to read at 18 wrote his legacy not in books but in iron and steam, in embankments and viaducts, in the simple fact that railways work. George Stephenson proved that genius can emerge from anywhere, that formal education and natural talent are different things, that the gap between impossible and done is often just determination and careful observation. Those lessons remain relevant regardless of technological change. The standard gauge George chose in 1825 still carries 60% of the world's rail traffic. That's not because it's mathematically optimal or theoretically perfect. It's because George noticed wheels binding on curves and adjusted the rails outward by a quarter inch. A practical fix to an immediate problem became permanent global infrastructure. Think about what that means. Every railway engineer since has worked within constraints George established while solving a local issue at Killingworth. The entire spatial organisation of modern logistics, the placement of loading docks and freight terminals, and passenger platforms, all determined by a decision made to prevent wheel binding on a colliery line. This is how transformative technologies actually develop, not through grand theoretical breakthroughs, but through incremental improvements by people solving immediate problems. George wasn't trying to change the world, he was trying to move coal more efficiently. The world changed anyway. His lack of formal education wasn't the heartwarming, obstacle overcome story the Victorians made it. It was simply irrelevant. What mattered was observational acuity, systematic experimentation, and willingness to trust results over theory. University-trained engineers declared Chat Moss impassable based on calculations. George tried different approaches until one worked. The Moss didn't care about credentials, but we shouldn't romanticize this either. George made mistakes a more thorough theoretical grounding might have prevented. Some bridges required strengthening, some route choices proved suboptimal, The partnership with Robert, who had formal education, produced better results than George alone could achieve. The ideal combined both approaches. What's remarkable is the compression of time. George was born when transportation meant horses and died when railways spanned continents. That transformation happened within a single lifetime. He didn't cause all of it, but he was the hinge that turned possibility into reality. Others had built experimental locomotives. George built commercial railways. The wealth he accumulated, the estate he purchased, the social status he achieved, these were byproducts, not goals. George never stopped being the boy who dismantled colliery engines to understand how they worked. Tapton House's hothouses were just another engineering challenge, growing pineapples instead of building locomotives. Same mentality, different application. His generosity toward workers' families reveals values formed in poverty. George remembered what precariousness felt like. When men died building his railways, he didn't shrug and hire replacements. He supported their widows and children. This wasn't legally required. It was morally chosen. The safety lamp controversy exposes the class warfare underlying technical disputes. Humphrey Davy couldn't accept that an uneducated colliery worker had independently solved the same problem. The assumption that innovation required aristocratic breeding and scientific training was so fundamental that evidence contradicting it got dismissed as fraud. George won that battle through persistence, but the prejudice never disappeared. Railway construction killed people. Accidents during building, operational disasters, workers crushed between couplings, or buried in tunnel collapses. George's railways were safer than previous transport methods, but safe is relative. The human cost was real, paid mostly by people whose names aren't recorded. This complicates the legacy without negating it. Railways enabled industrialization that lifted living standards for millions, while creating new forms of exploitation and environmental damage. Technology is morally neutral. Application determines impact. George built tools. Others decided how to use them. The question of whether he was a great man or simply the right person in the right place at the right time is unanswerable and probably meaningless. History doesn't run controlled experiments. We can't know what would have happened if George had died young, or stayed in Scotland, or never learned to read. Someone else might have built railways eventually, but not the same railways, not with the same standards, not creating the same network effects. Individual agency matters, but it operates within constraints. George's talents found application because British industrialisation created demand for better transportation. His practical approach worked because steam technology had matured to the point of mobile application. His railways succeeded because capital was available and legal structures permitted large projects. Remove any of these conditions and the outcome changes. What endures is the principle he demonstrated. That observation and experimentation can solve problems. Theory declares unsolvable. Chapmoss was impossible until it wasn't. Locomotives couldn't handle gradients until they could. Railways wouldn't be commercially viable until they were. George ignored the impossibility and focused on the mechanism. This works beyond engineering. Any complex challenge becomes manageable when broken into solvable components. George didn't set out to revolutionize transportation. He improved colliery engines, then built better locomotives, then designed functioning railways. Each step was achievable. The cumulative result was transformation. The apprenticeship model he used with Robert combined practical experience and theoretical knowledge, hands-on work and evening study. This hybrid approach became standard for engineering education precisely because it worked. Universities eventually incorporated laboratory work and industrial placements, acknowledging that pure theory was insufficient. George proved the point before educational institutions accepted it. His death in 1848 came at the inflection point. Railways were established in Britain, spreading across Europe and America, but the true railway age was ahead. The peak of construction, the complete reordering of economic geography, the social transformation of mobility. All this occurred after George was gone. He built the foundation and never saw the full structure. Robert carried forward the work, surpassing his father in some technical achievements. The bridges Robert designed were more ambitious than anything George attempted, but Robert always acknowledged that he'd learned fundamentals at his father's side, working through mathematics problems together after George's long days in the collieries. The partnership transcended George's death through the engineers Robert trained and the methods he promoted. The Stephenson locomotive works in Newcastle continued producing engines for decades, supplying railways worldwide, maintaining the reputation George had established. Thousands of locomotives bearing the Stephenson name operated across 6 continents, each one descended from the experimental engines George had built at Killingworth. Modern high-speed rail bears little surface resemblance to George's locomotives. Electric power, streamlined design, computerized control systems, speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Yet the fundamental technology remains steel wheels on steel rails, following fixed routes, and most of those routes use the gauge George established. The technology evolved while preserving his template. Climate change adds complexity to the legacy. Railways in George's era were dramatically cleaner than alternatives. Horse waste polluted cities. Early roads were environmental disasters. Steam locomotives seemed like pure progress. Today, diesel emissions are problematic, but railways remain more efficient than automobiles or Beche aircraft for many purposes. Electric trains powered by renewables could fulfill George's vision while addressing modern concerns. The economic transformation he enabled was real and enormous. Transportation costs dropped 80%, industries became viable, urban populations could be fed, manufacturing could scale. Britain's mid-19th century dominance rested substantially on railway infrastructure George had pioneered. Other nations recognised this and built their own networks, usually following his methods. But economic growth came with costs. Workers died in construction accidents. Communities were displaced by route planning. Coal mining accelerated with attendant dangers. The benefits weren't evenly distributed. Railway wealth concentrated in fewer hands, while risks fell on labourers. Technology magnified existing inequalities even while creating new opportunities. George's life demonstrates that expertise develops through multiple paths. Formal education is one route, but systematic self-teaching combined with hands-on experience can produce equivalent or superior results. The assumption that credentials determine capability was proven false by someone who couldn't read until 18, yet became Britain's foremost railway engineer. This challenges institutional gatekeeping while acknowledging that knowledge matters regardless of its source. George succeeded despite lacking formal training, but he didn't succeed through ignorance. He learned voraciously, studied continuously, and sought knowledge from anyone who could provide it. The self-education was as rigorous as any university program, just structured differently. What made him extraordinary wasn't the lack of education. It was the determination to acquire knowledge despite obstacles, the willingness to learn from failure, the refusal to accept that problems were unsolvable just because experts said so. These qualities matter more than credentials in determining who actually accomplishes difficult things. The gauge standardization he fought for proved essential as networks expanded. Technical superiority meant nothing if your railway couldn't connect with others.